Welcome, everyone. Before we even start, do yourself a massive favor and hit that like and subscribe button right now.
Definitely do that.
Seriously, you are going to want to be subscribed for this one. Today's deep dive is reviewing an incredibly provocative, ultra-long, and undeniably incisive new ebook that has just been lighting up the internet.
It really has.
Right off the bat, I want to tell you to check Amazon Kindle and Google Play Books to buy this book for yourself so you can follow along with the data we are about to discuss. And make sure you go follow the author at Conrad Riker at Substack.
It is definitely a text that demands a much closer look. I mean, the scale of the argument being made here is sweeping.
Sweeping is the perfect word for it. The book is called Memory Hole: How Feminism and Cultural Marxism Rewrite History to Remove God, the Father, and Virtues by Conrad Riker.
Right.
Now, to give you some necessary context, this book is explicitly written for and targeted at men's rights activists, red-pilled men, and those generally tuned into the manosphere. Its core premise is all about understanding the deep history of our fundamental institutions.
Education, law, tech, religion.
Exactly. Understanding them before they were, as the author claims, systematically captured by feminists and cultural Marxists.
And we need to lay down a very clear disclaimer for you right here at the start. The material we are unpacking today is highly politically charged.
Highly.
It touches on the most deeply polarizing issues of our current cultural moment.
Completely polarizing. It is guaranteed to make a lot of people very uncomfortable.
Exactly. Because of that, our mission today is not to endorse or validate these viewpoints. We are absolutely not taking a political side here.
No, not at all.
Nor are we here to condemn it. Our role is simply to act as your impartial guides. We are here to impartially unpack the fascinating, complex, and highly controversial arguments the author makes.
We just want to help you understand exactly how this specific worldview is constructed based on the text Riker has written.
Right, what the underlying mechanics of his theory actually are.
Okay, let's unpack this, starting with the title itself, the concept of the memory hole. Have you ever noticed how historical narratives seem to be shifting rapidly?
Yeah, constantly.
You know, the stories of exploration, invention, and leadership you were taught in school versus what is being aggressively pushed into the mainstream right now.
Right.
Well, Riker claims this isn't just a natural generational evolution of how we view history. From his perspective, it is a deliberate, engineered erasure of men. He introduces this concept of the memory hole as an overarching theme of digital and cultural erasure. And to start his argument, he points a massive finger directly at Silicon Valley, specifically tech giants like Google, and introduces what he calls the doodle doctrine.
Yes, the doodle doctrine and the representation override principle. Let's take a step back and look at what this actually means mechanically. Riker is focusing on Google Doodles.
The little cartoons on the search page.
Right, the illustrations or animations that replace the Google logo on its search homepage to celebrate holidays, events, or historical figures. Now, to the average person, these might just seem like fun little educational cartoons.
Sure.
But Riker argues that Google uses its daily doodles not to reflect the objective scale of historical reality, but to artificially invert it to serve a highly specific ideological agenda.
Because the homepage of Google is arguably the most viewed piece of digital real estate in human history.
Exactly. He argues that whoever controls that image controls the cultural memory of the populace.
And he brings a ton of receipts, or at least his specific interpretation of the historical data to back this up. For example, he zeroes in on June 23, 2021.
Okay.
On that day, Google ran a doodle honoring Marie Tharp. Now, Tharp was a 1950s ocean floor cartographer. Riker spends a bit of time acknowledging that her work was perfectly solid and useful.
Right, he's not saying she didn't do anything.
Right. But he points out that June 23 is also the date historically associated with Captain James Cook, one of the most significant and consequential figures in the history of maritime exploration.
Right.
Cook charted more of the planet than any man before him. Hawaii, Australia, New Zealand, vast swaths of the Pacific. Yet, on his anniversary, Cook was entirely ignored in favor of Tharp.
Riker uses this specific juxtaposition to illustrate a deliberate pattern. He claims it's not a mere oversight by a well-meaning tech company.
He views it as a calculated editing of history.
If we connect this to the bigger picture, Riker's arguing that the algorithm is performing a psychological operation. By elevating a relatively minor, albeit competent female figure over a massive male historical titan on his own anniversary, the platform is teaching the next generation something very specific.
That male achievement is unremarkable.
Yes, even on a civilization-altering scale. while female achievement, no matter the scale, is paramount.
He highlights another glaring example that I found really interesting to read about. June 10th, that is the birthday of Nikola Tesla. According to the book, instead of honoring the man who fundamentally revolutionized electrical engineering, pioneered alternating current, and essentially laid the groundwork for the modern grid, Google chose to run a doodle for Dolores Alves.
Dolores Alves.
Right, who's Dolores Alves?
Yeah.
She was a 19th century Uruguayan apothecary and herbalist.
And again, Riker's argument isn't necessarily that Alves was a bad person. She likely helped her local community immensely with her herbal remedies. But the text points out the absurdity of the scale.
Right, the scale.
She didn't change the course of human civilization. Tesla did. Riker claims this substitution happens because of strict internal diversity quotas within these tech companies that inherently prioritize progressive ideology over actual historical impact.
It gets even more pronounced. He cites a staggering example from June 6, 2023. June 6th is D-Day, the 80th anniversary of the largest amphibious invasion in human history. An operation that broke the back of fascism in Europe and cost thousands of young men their lives in a single morning.
Right.
On that specific day, instead of honoring the soldiers who stormed Normandy, Google ran a doodle honoring a local Portland transgender activist who had absolutely zero connection to the military, the event, or the era.
What's fascinating here is how Riker connects these specific, highly visible digital choices to broader cognitive and psychological shifts in modern society. He makes the case that this constant drip feed of altered history is actually working.
It is working, yeah.
To prove this, he cites a 2023 Harvard digital memory study claiming that 73% of Generation Z now believe a woman invented the light bulb.
Well, I want to stop on that statistic for a second. 73%. Is Riker actually suggesting that a vast majority of an entire generation has had their basic historical knowledge completely overwritten?
According to the argument laid out in the book, yes, absolutely. Riker points out the mechanics of how this happens. If you typed who invented the light bulb into a search engine recently, he claims the algorithm would actively surface women in STEM listicles and articles about female laboratory assistants long before it mentioned Thomas Edison or Joseph Swan. He argues that this isn't an organic shift in public interest, it's top-down algorithmic engineering. He points to Google's alleged response to user complaints when they skipped Albert Einstein's birthday. They allegedly replied, "We celebrate underrepresented voices." For Riker, this phrase is the smoking gun of his thesis.
How so?
Because he argues that the tech giants aren't denying Einstein's genius, they are simply stating that they no longer care about genius, innovation, or historical impact if it happens to come from a white male historical figure.
So excellence isn't the metric anymore.
Exactly. Excellence is no longer the metric for celebration demographic underrepresentation is.
He calls this soft totalitarianism. He makes a point to say it's not the jackboots, gulags, and secret police of the 20th century. It's cheerful cartoons, colorful logos, and friendly community guidelines quietly rewriting reality right in front of us.
Right.
And Riker claims this digital erasure doesn't stay on the screen, it spills directly into the physical world. This brings us to a massive section of the book, the war on statues and what he terms historical gaslighting.
This is a major structural pillar of his entire worldview. Riker characterizes the recent wave of removing historical monuments as reverse iconoclasm. Let's define that. Iconoclasm is the destruction of religious icons or monuments, usually for religious or political motives. Riker argues the modern goal isn't to correct historical injustice or foster a more inclusive public square. He claims the goal is a systematic, methodical destruction of merit-based monuments, specifically male ones, and replacing them with symbols of grievance and victimhood.
He gives some examples that genuinely make you pause and wonder about the underlying logic of these movements. For instance, in Rio de Janeiro, rioters tore down a statue of Hans Christian Andersen.
Hans Christian Andersen.
Now think about that. Hans Christian Andersen, the guy who wrote The Little Mermaid, The Ugly Duckling, and The Emperor's New Clothes. Riker asks the reader, why him?
Yeah, why him?
He wasn't a conqueror. He wasn't involved in the slave trade. He wasn't a political tyrant. He was a storyteller.
Right.
Riker claims he was targeted simply because he was a successful, dead white male, and therefore, in the eyes of the mob, inherently part of an oppressive patriarchy.
He pairs that with the situation in London, where the monument to Winston Churchill was repeatedly defaced and spray-painted with the word racist, requiring it to be boarded up in a protective box. The text argues that this entirely ignores his singular role in holding the line against Adolf Hitler when the rest of Europe had fallen. Riker draws a very sharp, deliberate contrast here to highlight the ideological hypocrisy.
Right. The double standard he points out is wild.
Precisely. He points out that while figures like Churchill, James Cook, or even Abraham Lincoln are targeted for removal or vandalism, statues of actual historically verified mass murderers and dictators remain entirely untouched or are quietly respected on progressive university campuses.
Yeah, he lists a few, right?
He specifically names statues and busts of Mao Zedong, Vladimir Lenin, and Idi Amin. The author argues this exposes the reality of the movement. It is not about human rights. If it were, Mao and Lenin would be the first to go. Instead, Riker claims it is specifically about dismantling the archetypes of Western masculine success.
Here's where it gets really interesting. He talks about the institutional complicity in this erasure. It's not just angry mobs in the street. It's the administrators in the highest halls of academia.
Yes.
He points to Yale University renaming Calhoun College. Now, John C. Calhoun is a controversial historical figure, but Riker points out that the university administrators explicitly stated they were renaming the college because the name itself sounded oppressive to current students.
Just the sound of it.
Not because they had uncovered new historical facts, but because the mere phonetic sound of a historical male name was deemed psychologically harmful.
And he extends this institutional critique to our national museums. Riker claims the American History Museum in Washington, D.C. removed a prominent display on the Wright brothers, the men who literally invented, built, and flew the first powered aircraft, and replaced it with an exhibit on lesbian aviators of the 1980s.
I have to ask, what is the author's angle on the aviators they replaced the Wright brothers with? Does he claim they made significant technological leaps?
According to Riker, no. He explicitly states that these 1980s aviators never broke significant speed records, didn't invent new aerodynamic frameworks, and never flew combat missions.
Oh.
Their primary historical achievement in the context of the museum exhibit was their sexual orientation and gender. The author uses these examples to build a psychological theory he calls the guilt transfer framework.
Okay, break down the guilt transfer framework for us. How does the author see this operating on the mind of the average man walking down the street?
The premise here is that this is a sophisticated psychological warfare tactic. By tearing down statues of male builders, explorers, and leaders, the culture is attempting to blame living men for the alleged sins of the past.
Okay, I follow.
If you can convince a society that men of the past built absolutely nothing of value, or that their massive technological and cultural achievements are entirely negated by their personal flaws or the moral standards of the 21st century, then modern men are left with no historical lineage.
They're severed from their roots.
Exactly. Therefore, instead of drawing inspiration and pride from their ancestors, modern men are forced into a state of perpetual apology.
That makes the anecdote he shares about the father in Bristol, UK, make total sense within his framework. Riker tells the story of a local father who went out to physically defend a statue of Edward Colston.
Right.
Now, again, Colston is a highly controversial historical figure deeply tied to the transatlantic slave trade. But Riker isn't defending Colston's history. He's highlighting the state's reaction.
The double standard again?
Yes. This father was arrested by police under the UK's Public Order Act for defending the public monument, while Riker notes that the vandals who illegally tore it down, dragged it through the streets, and threw it into the harbor walked entirely free and were celebrated by local politicians.
This raises an important question for Riker's readers. Who does the law actually protect? He argues that the ultimate goal of removing these statues, renaming these buildings, and prosecuting men who resist isn't just about changing bronze and marble.
Right.
It's about removing the historical justification for male leadership. If the past is entirely toxic, then male authority in the present is entirely illegitimate.
Which flows seamlessly into his next major section, the airbrushing of inventors and warriors in the education system and in entertainment media.
Yes.
Riker argues that this erasure isn't just happening in Silicon Valley algorithms and national museums, it's happening right in your kids' classrooms. It's targeting the most vulnerable minds. He shares a deeply personal and frustrating anecdote about flipping through his 12-year-old nephew's middle school history textbook.
Yes, the textbook anecdote is a cornerstone of this chapter. Riker claims he found passages asserting that indigenous caregivers or communal feminine energy were primarily responsible for the construction of the Egyptian pyramids, the conceptualization of the light bulb, and the early iterations of the steam engine.
It sounds almost like parody, but he presents it as verified curriculum. His nephew actually lost points on a history quiz for writing that slave labor and male architects built the pyramids.
He lost points.
The teacher physically crossed out the answer and corrected him, writing that modern historical narratives now reflect the impact of collaborative feminine energy.
Wow.
Riker uses this to illustrate a terrifying, point-verified, hard historical facts are being actively replaced with what he calls emotionally convenient fiction.
He points to changes at the highest levels of scientific institutions as well. He brings up the Royal Society in the United Kingdom, one of the oldest and most prestigious scientific bodies in the world.
Right.
According to the book, the Royal Society issued commemorative stamps that replaced historical giants like Sir Isaac Newton and Charles Darwin with entirely fictionalized women.
Yes. The example he gives is Dr. Amina Patel, quantum weaver. Riker absolutely mocks this. He writes that quantum weaver sounds like a trendy yoga instructor at a Silicon Valley corporate retreat, not a historical scientist who discovered the laws of motion or evolution.
Exactly.
He argues that the culture is so desperate to unseat male achievement that they are literally inventing fake women out of thin air, rather than teaching about real, impactful female scientists like Qianxiong Wu or Marie Curie.
And why does the text claim they do this? Because, according to Riker, the real women of history don't fit the required modern narrative. Real female scientists worked incredibly hard, often in tandem with male colleagues, and succeeded through rigorous merit.
Right, they actually did the work.
They weren't perpetually oppressed victims, and they didn't rely on communal feminine energy. They relied on the scientific method. Riker argues the system prefers to invent a fictional quantum weaver because she can be perfectly molded to embody modern intersectional grievances.
And this deliberate rewriting extends massively into entertainment media. Riker cites a Netflix series called She Made It. According to the book, this series tells the story of early electrical innovation, but essentially replaces Nikola Tesla with a fictional transgender woman from Detroit who allegedly harnessed electromagnetic fields through, and I quote, emotional resonance.
He also mentions a BBC documentary series titled Her Story of Invention, which he claims credits the invention of the printing press not to Johannes Gutenberg, but to a fictional 15th century female scribe named Elspeth von Gutenberg, framing Johannes as merely a frontman who stole her ideas.
Riker labels this the hero insertion pattern. It's a storytelling template where women are retroactively inserted into the center of massively complex, male-dominated achievements to create a fake sense of historical gender balance.
But he notes they never retroactively insert women into historical atrocities or massive failures, only the triumphs.
Exactly. And it's not just the inventors getting this treatment. They're doing it to the warriors, the men who bled for civilization too.
This is where Riker's tone shifts from analytical to deeply indignant. He cites a highly concerning Veterans Affairs report claiming that 68% of aging World War II veterans feel a profound sense of shame or hesitation about wearing their service medals in public today.
That's incredibly sad.
The text argues this is because the prevailing culture has shifted so radically that their sacrifice is now viewed through a lens of toxic imperialism.
He mentions a specific course at UC Santa Cruz, a gender studies class, that explicitly frames the D-Day invasion as an imperialist frat boy suicide mission. How should you really think about that?
Yeah.
Imagine looking a 90-year-old veteran in the eye, a man who watched his friends get cut down by machine gun fire on Omaha Beach to stop the Holocaust, and telling him his service was just frat boy imperialism. Riker argues that Hollywood is actively, gleefully participating in this sacrifice denial.
The examples he pulls from modern streaming platforms are meant to show a complete detachment from historical reality. He points to a Hulu original movie called The Forgotten Front, which completely invents a black female sniper named Naomi Cross and frames her as the pivotal figure turning the tide at the Battle of the Bulge.
Wow.
Meanwhile, the film entirely ignores the real, documented heroes of that battle, like Medal of Honor recipient Audie Murphy.
He also brings up a Netflix film called Apollo Her, which he claims completely cuts Neil Armstrong out of the narrative of the moon landing to focus the emotional core of the film on a fictional female astronaut named Erin Cale, who was silenced by the boys' club at NASA.
Let's take a step back and look at what this actually means for the audience. This raises an important question for Riker. What happens to the psychology of young boys who consume this media and sit in these classrooms?
Right.
If every inventor is revealed to be a thief and every warrior is framed as a toxic imperialist, what model of masculinity is left for a young boy to aspire to? This leads directly into his massive thesis on the boy crisis and what he formally calls pedagogical capture.
Right. And if you have a son, a nephew, or a grandson, you need to hear exactly what Riker is laying out here. Riker argues that the modern education system fundamentally, structurally pathologizes natural male behavior. It treats boyhood as a disease that needs to be cured. He tells a heartbreaking story of a 6-year-old boy in an Ohio elementary school who was put on Ritalin. Why? Simply because he wanted to run around the playground during recess instead of sitting quietly in a circle and reading poetry.
The medicalization of boyhood is a huge focus for the author. Riker backs up this anecdote with a staggering CDC statistic claiming that 30% of American boys are diagnosed with ADHD by the age of 12.
30%.
The text asks us to consider, is it actually mathematically possible that 1/3 of all male children have a neurological disorder? Or is the system demanding a level of stationary compliance that is biologically unnatural for young males? Riker argues it's the latter. He claims that schools have meticulously created a school-to-activist pipeline.
Okay, let's unpack this. How does this school-to-activist pipeline function, according to the book?
From the author's perspective, this pipeline works by taking young boys whose natural energy, boisterousness, and competitiveness are treated as clinical disorders. They are medicated to sit still. Then, once they are compliant, they are forced to apologize for their biology. He claims boys are subjected to mandatory toxic masculinity modules, where they must publicly deconstruct their male identity and confess their inherent privilege.
While the girls get something completely different.
Exactly. Simultaneously, in the exact same schools, young girls are pulled into empowerment seminars, confidence circles, and given endless positive reinforcement about their gender.
And the result of this? Riker claims it is causing a mass exodus. He points to the massive drop in male college enrollment, which has plummeted down to around 40% nationwide. He says boys aren't failing out. They are consciously disengaging because they realize the system is openly structurally hostile to them. Riker actually goes so far as to advise young men reading his book to skip the traditional college route entirely.
Yeah, he pushes the alternatives hard.
He points to the Peter Thiel Fellowship, which pays young entrepreneurs to drop out of school, and he heavily advocates for trade schools, coding boot camps, plumbing, and physical apprenticeships. He argues that modern universities are no longer places of learning, but ideological debt traps designed to break the male spirit while extracting their future wealth.
Riker describes the ultimate result of this educational capture as a misandrist double bind. Let's define what a double bind is. It's a psychological dilemma in which an individual receives two or more conflicting messages, with one negating the other.
Right.
Society tells young men they must be strong, they must provide, they must protect, and they must lead. But the moment they exhibit the traits necessary to do those things, competitiveness, stoicism, aggression, decisiveness, they are immediately labeled toxic, domineering, or patriarchal.
Exactly. But if they do the opposite, if they show vulnerability, if they cry, if they step back and refuse to lead, they are deemed weak, pathetic, and undateable.
Precisely. Riker argues there is absolutely no way for a man to win in this current cultural framework. It is a rigged game designed to produce anxiety and paralysis.
So what does this all mean? How did the culture get to a point where this double bind is enforced so fiercely and with such emotional intensity? Well, Riker makes what is arguably his most provocative and controversial claim in the entire book right here.
It is definitely the most debated section.
He argues that modern progressive and feminist activism isn't purely a philosophical or ideological movement. He claims it is heavily fueled by neurochemistry. He calls it chemical activism.
Yes, this is where Riker connects macrocultural trends to micropharmacology. It is a highly debated assertion. He cites a 2023 medical statistic claiming that 18% of American women are currently prescribed and taking antidepressants, specifically SSRIs.
Wow.
He notes that this is nearly double the rate of men.
He takes this data and proposes a radical theory he calls the estrogen SSRI feedback loop. Let's get into the mechanics of this because it's wild.
Yeah.
He argues that SSRIs essentially mute the prefrontal cortex.
The logical center.
Right, the prefrontal cortex is the part of the brain responsible for logical nuance, future planning, and impulse control. At the same time, he claims these drugs amplify the amygdala, which is the primitive fear, anxiety, and rage center of the brain. When you combine this chemically altered brain state with natural estrogen fluctuations, he claims it creates a self-sustaining biological rage engine. It replaces the capacity for rational, nuanced debate with rigid, aggressive, and highly emotional binaries.
To illustrate how this looks in the real world, Riker pulls examples from internet culture. He uses a viral Reddit thread from a man describing what he called his girlfriend's Prozac tantrum. In the story, the girlfriend allegedly screamed at him for 45 uninterrupted minutes, using high-level academic jargon about internalized patriarchy and systemic oppression, all triggered over a minor household chore.
Just a chore.
Right. Later, she allegedly apologized and blamed the outburst entirely on her recently increased dose of fluoxetine.
He backs this up with a personal anecdote, too. He describes being at a tech conference where a female academic began literally screaming at him during a Q&A session. He says he merely asked a highly technical question about her data, and she exploded, calling his questioning colonizer energy and intellectual violence.
Wow.
Riker notes that later that evening, she proudly tweeted that she was riding an estrogen surge plus Zoloft and didn't care who she offended.
Riker uses an analogy here that is crucial to understanding his perspective. He views this extreme emotional volatility not as a valid political stance, but as a neurological glitch. He calls it pharmacological projection. His thesis is that society is currently taking the chemical side effects of a heavily medicated demographic and celebrating those side effects as a moral and cultural revolution.
And again, to remind you, as we guide you through this dense text, we are impartially unpacking Riker's claims. We're not doctors and we're not validating his medical theories. But to understand the book, you have to understand that he is asserting that the loudest, most aggressive voices in modern feminism are literally being chemically turbocharged.
Right, that's his core argument there.
He believes this medication makes them hypersensitive to perceived slights and completely incapable of rational de-escalation. And this, he argues, has terrifying real-world consequences for men trying to navigate the workplace and interpersonal relationships.
Which brings us precisely to the real-world execution of these cultural shifts, what Riker calls the victimhood industry and the death of chivalry. He dedicates a massive portion of the book to diving deep into how corporate human resources departments, university Title IX tribunals, and the overarching Me Too movement have been weaponized to structurally eliminate men.
Let's talk about the mechanics of that weaponization. Riker outlines a process he calls the victim triad. It consists of 3 steps: accuse, amplify, annihilate. He argues that the cultural mandate to believe all women, which sounds like a plea for empathy on the surface, actually functions as a mechanism to entirely bypass legal due process.
Right.
It inherently shifts the burden of proof, treating men as guilty upon the moment of accusation, with no evidence required other than the emotional testimony of the accuser.
To demonstrate this shift, he gives a chilling example of a Boeing aerospace engineer who was suspended from his job and had his career derailed. Why? Was he accused of physical harassment or inappropriate touching? No.
No.
According to the text, the engineer was suspended simply for sharing a peer-reviewed Wall Street Journal article about spatial reasoning differences between men and women in a private, employee-only Slack group.
A peer-reviewed scientific article.
Yes. But the corporate HR department labeled the mere presence of the article as creating a hostile work environment. Riker argues this case perfectly illustrates how the modern corporate system protects female emotional comfort over factual, scientific discussion, putting men's livelihoods in constant, unpredictable jeopardy.
It's all subjective.
Exactly. The rules are entirely subjective and based on the feelings of the most easily offended person in the room.
And this weaponization doesn't just stay in corporate Slack channels. It extends into basic, everyday interactions on the street, resulting in what Riker terms the chivalry penalty. This is where the book gets incredibly bleak. He provides several striking anecdotes of men trying to do the right thing and being punished for it.
Right, like the incident he details involving a man in Toronto. This man was on a crowded public transit train and politely offered his seat to a woman who appeared heavily pregnant.
Just a normal, polite thing to do.
Exactly. Instead of a simple thank you or a polite decline, the woman took offense. She reported him to the transit police, accusing him of performative paternalism and assuming she was weak. The man was actually issued an official warning by the transit authority.
Or the story of the Austin, Texas firefighter. Riker claims this firefighter, while on duty, helped an elderly woman safely cross a busy street. But a younger woman, observing the interaction, reported him to his department's HR, claiming he was invading personal space and asserting male dominance over the elderly woman.
Wow.
The firefighter was formally reprimanded.
The statistics Riker pulls to back this up are startling. He cites records indicating that the UK Metropolitan Police logged 127 specific cases in a single year, of men being investigated or arrested for assault, harassment, or disturbing the peace simply after they physically intervened to help women who appeared to be in distress, such as breaking up a mugging or offering first aid.
If we connect this to the bigger picture, what is Riker saying the outcome of this is?
He argues that this creates a massive society-wide disincentive loop. Why would any rational man offer his seat, hold a door, or intervene in a dangerous situation if the simple act of offering help risks his career, his reputation, or his freedom? The risk-to-reward ratio for chivalry has been inverted.
Exactly. He cites a comprehensive Harvard sociological study showing a precipitous 22% drop in male civic participation over the last decade. This includes volunteering, mentoring at-risk youth, coaching Little League, and neighborhood watch programs.
They're just stepping back.
Right. Riker asserts that men aren't becoming lazy. They are actively withdrawing from public life out of sheer self-preservation. Riker's point is that society is aggressively punishing the very male virtues, altruism, protection, and physical intervention that it used to rely on to keep the social fabric intact.
And Riker doesn't just see this systematic dismantling happening in secular institutions like HR departments or schools. He pushes his thesis into the spiritual realm. He argues that cultural Marxism is actively dismantling the metaphysical foundation of masculinity within the church itself.
This brings us to his section on religious revisionism, or what he dramatically calls the sacred inversion. He claims that the effort to erase men goes all the way up to the concept of God.
Yeah, this part's intense.
He details the case of Pastor Mark Jennings, a minister who was literally defrocked and removed from his congregation. Why? Because he refused mandates to refer to God as they and insisted on using traditional biblical masculine pronouns during his sermons.
Riker points out that this isn't an isolated incident. He notes that Sweden's state church officially voted to remove the word father from its liturgy entirely, replacing it with gender-neutral terms like the parent, the nurturer, or the source. Furthermore, he points to modern Bible translations. He specifically calls out the New Revised Standard Version Updated Edition, the NRS View. According to Riker's analysis, this modern translation deliberately removed the word father 127 times from the Gospels, systematically swapping it for generic gender-neutral alternatives.
The examples of this theological shift are wild. He highlights a massive United Nations project called Faith and Gender Equality. Riker claims this initiative is actively working with progressive theologians to rewrite the Genesis narrative.
Right.
The goal: to linguistically frame Eve, not Adam, as the primary image of God. And if that wasn't enough, he mentions a paper from the Harvard Divinity School that seriously suggested the biblical prophet Moses might have suffered from gender dysphoria.
Really?
Yes, simply because he was initially reluctant to take on the hyper-masculine role of leading the Israelites out of Egypt.
What's fascinating here is Riker's extrapolation of these theological events. He speculates that this is not just an academic exercise, it is a deliberate psychological strategy. Let's break down the logic of the book. When you systematically erase the concept of the Father from God, when the ultimate archetype of authority, creation, and judgment is stripped of its masculinity, you conceptually erase the necessity of the Father from the human family.
Wow. So he's linking the changing of Bible pronouns directly to the breakdown of the nuclear family. What?
Yes. The text argues that religion has historically provided men with a metaphysical framework for their responsibilities. God the Father provides the blueprint for the human father. By neutering the divine, Riker argues, the church is leaving men spiritually disarmed. They are alienated from their faith, told that their masculine instincts are sinful, and further isolated from the moral frameworks that used to give their sacrifices meaning.
So we've covered the digital erasure by tech algorithms, the physical erasure in museums and statues, the psychological capture of boys in education, the chemical volatility of modern activism, the HR weaponization of the workplace, and the neutering of God in religion.
It's a lot.
It is. But Riker argues that the ultimate trap, the final boss for men in modern society, is the family core system and the broader societal narrative about privilege. This brings us to his devastating chapter on the myth of patriarchy and what he bluntly calls the marriage plantation.
In this section, Riker vehemently and systematically dismantles the mainstream idea of systemic male privilege. To do this, he leans heavily on the work of Warren Farrell. Now, for those who don't know, Warren Farrell is a fascinating figure. He was originally a prominent feminist in the 1970s, serving on the board of the National Organization for Women, before fundamentally shifting his views and becoming one of the founding fathers of the modern men's rights movement.
Right.
Riker uses Farrell's concept of the power paradox.
I want to stop and define the power paradox,
Yeah.
because it's central to Riker's argument. The idea is that society looks at the absolute apex of the hierarchy, CEOs, presidents, billionaires, and sees that they are mostly men. Therefore, society concludes that men have all the power.
Right.
But the paradox is that if you look at the absolute bottom of society, the homeless, the incarcerated, the suicide victims, the workplace fatalities, they are also overwhelmingly men. Riker argues that true systemic power doesn't look like an hourglass with men at the top and bottom. Systemic power means you are protected, and men are not protected.
To put a human face on this paradox, Riker tells the heartbreaking, infuriating story of Earl Thompson. Thompson was a generational coal miner. He worked brutal 80-hour weeks deep underground for 30 years to provide for his family. He eventually died of black lung disease at the age of 58.
Tragic.
Riker juxtaposes Earl's life with a quote from an elite tenured professor at Oberlin College who used demographics like Earl as an example of privileged patriarchal labor.
Riker asks the reader directly, where exactly is the privilege in dying early, coughing up coal dust from a dangerous job that destroys your body just to keep the lights on for the rest of society?
He backs up this emotional story with incredibly stark statistics. The book claims that 97% of all combat deaths in history are male, 93% of all workplace fatalities are male, 80% of all homeless individuals dying on the streets are male.
Those numbers are just staggering.
Riker argues that the patriarchy, if it exists at all, doesn't hand men power. It hands them a shovel, points them toward the danger, and demands they dig until they drop.
And then, when those same men try to do what society tells them is the honorable thing, build a family, Riker claims they unknowingly step onto what he calls the marriage plantation. That is a highly controversial term, but he uses it to describe a system of indentured servitude. He cites CDC data showing that nearly 90% of all college-educated divorces are initiated and filed by women.
He directs intense criticism at the legal frameworks governing domestic life, specifically attacking the Duluth model. Let's explain what that is. The Duluth model is a framework developed in the 1980s that drives a massive majority of domestic violence intervention programs and police training across the country.
Okay.
The core tenet of the Duluth model is that domestic violence is entirely rooted in patriarchal power and control. Riker argues this model is inherently flawed and biased because it treats men as the default perpetrators and women as the default victims in almost every domestic dispute.
Right, often mandating the arrest of the male, even if he was the one who called the police.
He also dives deep into family court precedent, highlighting cases like Dubé v. Wells to illustrate what he terms asymmetrical reproductive rights.
Here's where it gets really interesting. This is a complex legal argument. Riker asserts that in the modern era, women have absolute total reproductive choice. If a pregnancy occurs, the woman has the legal right to choose abortion, to carry the child to term, or to abandon the child safely under safe haven laws without any financial penalty.
Right.
Men, however, have zero legal choice after conception.
He calls it reproductive conscription. The moment conception occurs, the man is legally and financially bound to the outcome of the woman's choice for 18 years. Riker argues that family courts treat men as little more than walking ATMs, enforcing massive child support and alimony payments regardless of the circumstances.
Yeah.
Even if the man was lied to about birth control, even if he begged to be a father and was denied joint custody, the state will garnish his wages and throw him in prison if he fails to pay. He argues the system extracts male resources while completely denying them paternal authority.
So, after laying out this massive multi-front war on men standing algorithms, history, education, neurochemistry, corporate HR, the church, and the family courts, what is the conclusion? How does Riker say men are actually responding today? Do they just give up?
According to the book, no. He claims we are currently in the middle of a massive silent pushback that he calls the Great Awakening. Men aren't just taking this lying down, and they aren't engaging in the political system that they believe is rigged against them.
They're doing something else entirely.
Instead, they are simply walking away and rebuilding. They are reclaiming male spaces.
He details an incredible explosion of men's groups operating entirely outside the mainstream gaze. He talks about the Iron Brotherhood in Nashville. This started as just a group of guys meeting up to lift weights and do fitness training. But as the culture deteriorated, it evolved. Now they do tactical neighborhood patrols, training together to protect their communities because they no longer trust the police or the state to do it.
He also highlights the Friday Fire Circle in rural Idaho. This is a network where men meet weekly, completely off the grid, out in the woods. They build fires, share physical skills like carpentry or hunting, and mentor younger men who lack fathers.
That sounds pretty powerful.
And crucially, Riker notes, they do this without any female presence, HR oversight, or institutional permission. It is a return to primal, unfiltered male bonding. And he talks about the rise of silent hikes, where massive groups of men gather just to walk for miles in nature together, completely unplugged from their phones and the cultural noise.
Riker argues that this underground movement is a direct biological reaction to mainstream hostility. When the culture tells you that you are toxic, you leave the culture. He gives a great example of the mainstream trying to crush this. He talks about a slickly produced Netflix documentary called The Man Card, which was explicitly designed to paint men's rights activists and traditional masculinity as dangerous, toxic extremism.
But Riker notes the attempt completely backfired. The public backlash was massive and instantaneous. Men organized online and drove the film's rating down to a 1.8 on IMDb.
Wow.
They flooded the reviews, not with angry threats, but with articulate takedowns of the film's biased statistics, exposing it as blatant propaganda. It showed that men are no longer passively consuming the narrative, they are actively dismantling it.
He also tells the story of John Klein, a former steel worker who started what he calls the Silent Sacrifice Tour. Klein was disgusted by the attempts to rewrite history, so he spends his own money traveling the country to locate unmarked or neglected graves of WWI and WWII veterans.
That's amazing.
He cleans the headstones, plants flags, and honors their memory. Riker frames this as a direct physical pushback against the National Park Service, which he claims is busy trying to rebrand historical battlefield exhibits into sanitized concepts like caregivers in conflict. Klein is literally preserving the memory hole from swallowing these men.
And perhaps the most telling example of how terrified the establishment is of this awakening is what Riker claims happened in Europe. The book states that the French government actually passed a sweeping piece of legislation, the Loi de l'égalité historique, or the Law of Historical Equality,
Right.
specifically to ban Riker's book and similar texts because they allegedly overemphasized male achievement to a degree that was deemed a threat to public equality.
So what does this all mean? What does all of this mean for you, the listener? The overarching argument Riker is making in this final section is that censorship is actually the absolute best marketing. By pushing men out of mainstream universities, banning them from legacy media platforms, and demonizing them in the public square, the system hasn't defeated men at all.
If we connect this to the bigger picture, the system has simply driven men underground and made them vastly more resilient. It has pushed them to alternative, uncancelable platforms like Rumble, Substack, and X.
Right.
It has forced men to forge stronger, tighter, decentralized brotherhoods that the establishment can no longer monitor, tax, or control. Riker's entire thesis is that history, culture, and our fundamental institutions have been systematically hijacked and rewritten to establish a gynocentric society, one that extracts resources and physical protection from men while denying them any respect, peace, or authority. But the unintended consequence is that men are waking up to the game.
It is a massive, unyielding, and exhausting thesis. We've covered how Silicon Valley algorithms hide inventors, how museums replace aviation pioneers with fictionalized activists, how schools drug little boys just for having energy, how HR departments criminalize chivalry, how family courts financially trap fathers, and how the church is literally rewriting the Bible to neuter God. Conrad Riker's book, Memory Hole, leaves absolutely no stone unturned in its meticulous attempt to wake men up to this perceived reality.
This raises an important question, and it's a provocative thought I want to leave you with today. It's a concept that builds on everything we've discussed. If Riker is right, if society really is methodically punishing, taxing, and medicating the very traits like stoicism, physical bravery, competitiveness, and the protective instincts that historically built and maintained civilization, what happens when the breaking point is reached?
Right.
What happens to the physical and social infrastructure of our world, the power grids, the supply chains, the water systems, the military, when the men expected to quietly build and maintain it all decide to just permanently walk away? What happens when millions of men completely withdraw their labor, their ingenuity, and their protection to build their own silent sanctuaries off the grid?
It's a scenario straight out of Atlas Shrugged, but Riker is arguing it is happening right now in real time. That is a chilling and absolutely fascinating question to ponder. And that is exactly why we want you to explore these arguments for yourself. Do not just take our word for it. Go to Amazon Kindle and Google Play Books right now to buy the ebook Memory Hole. Read it, look at the data, the historical shifts, and the arguments firsthand. And be sure to follow the author, Ed Conrad Breicher, at Substack to keep up with his ongoing research. And before you go, please hit that like and subscribe button to support the deep dive and help us beat the algorithm. Thank you for joining us on this incredibly heavy journey. We'll see you next time.